Thanks, Pastor Steve. I've got some slides tonight, so if you could enable that, please. Well, it's the third time in 5 days that you got Barb Jackson again. And if my background looks a bit different, that's because I also moved house in the last couple of days. Just thought I'd do everything all at the same time, why not? Let's see. I've got the next part of Daniel for this. Right, so I think last time we talked about the abomination of desolation and that sort of thing. The events covered in the next few verses in Daniel 11, it runs from verse 32 to verse 35, if you want to follow along in your Bibles. And this spans a period of about 200 years. It goes from where we left last time in the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 AD, right up until the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And unlike the first part of this chapter, which was very sort of a blow-by-blow account of all the wars between the Greeks and the Greek successor kingdoms and that sort of thing, this gets into more of a broad description of the character of the Roman Empire and how it interacted with the church. So a lot of this material in this talk is taken from a book called The History of the Early Church, which I would show you, but it's in a box somewhere, and I don't know where it is anymore. Written by a historian named Eusebius in about 324 AD, so quite early on in the piece. And this book that he wrote sort of summarizes the first 300 years of Christianity. And the nice thing about it is that most of the work is not actually his own writing. It's just sort of quotations from letters, books, pamphlets, sort of epistles that were written by the first Christians in the early church. So it's quite a reliable, like first-hand account of the things that happened. And this book picks up around the end of the Gospels, runs parallel to the book of Acts, and then continues on past that for the next couple of hundred years, recounting the events in the New Testament up to the reign of the Emperor Constantine. It does start to kind of skew a bit Catholic towards the end, but we won't quite get up to there. So incidentally, on the topic of Catholics, the early church did actually call themselves the Catholic Church from about 100 AD. At the time, that was a fairly neutral term. It just really meant the universal church or the combined church as a whole. It was a term that was meant to encompass all the individual assemblies all around the world. Catholicism, as we know it today, with all the rituals and statues and all the cathedrals, that's what it turned into, 325 AD, after Constantine turned Christianity into the state religion. And we'll get into a bit of that later on. So we left off part 4 in the year 135 AD, when the Roman Emperor Hadrian, on the right there, placed the abomination, which was the Temple of Jupiter in Jerusalem, and that led to the Bar Kokhba revolt and the subsequent exile of all the Jews from Judea. And in this book of the early history of the church, Eusebius recounts the events of that. It says, from that time on, the entire race of Jews has been forbidden to set foot anywhere in the neighborhood of Jerusalem under the terms and ordinances of a law of the Emperor Hadrian, which ensured that not even from a distance might Jews have a view of their ancestral soil. That was the part of the desolation where they were completely kicked out of all of Judea, and they weren't even allowed to get close enough to Jerusalem to see it, just to make sure nothing ever, they didn't start up another uprising. So then we pick it up in verse 32 of Daniel 11. This verse says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So we'll break this down and see what this actually means. The first bit, such as do wickedly against the covenant. Do wickedly is the Hebrew word rasha, which means to violate something or condemn something. So it means the people who violated or condemned God's covenant. And that's, of course, referring to the Pharisees, the Jews of the time, because they rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was the new covenant. And so they rejected it, they did wickedly against the new covenant. So that means this first part, such as do wickedly against the covenant, it's talking about the Jews. And it says they shall be corrupted by flatteries. Now we know from previous verses that the person it's talking about who's doing these things is the king in the north. It's the person who's the ruler of the area around Syria and Israel. And corrupt there means to pollute, to defile, to make someone guilty. So this person, this king, made the Jews guilty of something. And we get a bit of an idea. And he made them guilty of something by flattering them. We get some idea about what these flatteries were in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 12, starting in verse 1, it said, "Now about this time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James the brother of John with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also." So what was happening is Herod, the ruler of Judea, was flattering the Jews, trying to please them, trying to appease them. In this case, by killing and capturing the early Christians. And by doing this, he was corrupting them. He was defiling them because he was making them complicit in the guilt of murdering these Christians. So we can sort of reword this verse to understand what it says. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. It means the Jews who rejected the covenant shall be made guilty by the king's actions, which he's doing to try to make them happy. And this continued on for the next few hundred years. Since the Jews were a very rebellious people and they were prone to uprisings and that sort of thing all the time, the governors of the area were always trying to do things to flatter them, to try and make them happy, to try and improve public order. Because the thing is, these governors, they were all accountable to the Roman emperor. And if, as a governor, your province isn't doing well, if it's being very rebellious, then you'll be removed from your place as a governor. So the governors were very interested in keeping the people happy. And in order to do that, they killed a lot of Christians to try and keep the Jews happy. Continuing on in the next half of that verse. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So to get a sense of how bad the persecution was in those early days, starting in the year 100, in the year 100, the Roman Emperor Trajan, who's the guy on the left there, he sent a letter to the governor of Judea saying that trying to put a stop to the practice of people going out hunting and killing Christians. He said, you're no longer allowed to go and hunt down Christians, but if you do happen to find one just by chance, you can still do whatever you like to them. But no active hunting of them. So when it says in verse 32, the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits, or in another interpretation, the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame and by captivity and by spoil many days. So the people who know their God, that's the early Christians. They're the people who didn't forsake the covenant like the Jews did. And they understood that Jesus was the Son of God. And they understood the will of God, that Jesus was there for a spiritual kingdom rather than a physical one. They're the people who knew their God. And these early Christians went out throughout the whole world and preached the gospel, as we know through the book of Acts. And we see in many epistles of the New Testament of all the different places they went, Thessalonica and Corinth and that. And that distribution was particularly as a result of them fleeing persecution. If we look in the book of Acts, chapter 8, verse 3, it says, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Therefore, they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word." Because of this persecution, they were scattered and the word went out even more. But wherever they went, they were still hunted down and they were killed by the sword and they were burned at the stake and enslaved and robbed for many, many years. And this was initially because the Jews hated the Christian doctrine. Because it was basically a branch of Judaism. It started off as the same thing as Judaism and then split off when they decided Jesus was the Messiah and the rest didn't. Because of that, Christianity was viewed as a blasphemous and a heretical branch of Judaism, and they hated it. But eventually, the Christians also came into contact with the Greeks and the Romans, and when they sort of encountered those cultures, the Greek and Roman belief that there were many gods clashed with the Christian belief that there was only one God. And early Christians were often called godless by the Greeks and the Romans because of that. Because, relatively speaking, if you only have one God compared to thousands of gods, you're godless. So as it says in verse 32, those early Christians stood firm and took action in the face of persecution, torture, and death. Many of them bravely and defiantly stuck to their Christian faith, confessing Christ right up to the very end. And I'll just look at one example of this. So this is an illustration of a man named Polycarp. He was the leader of the church in Smyrna, which I think we read about in Revelations a little bit. Smyrna today is called Izmir, and it's in Turkey somewhere. And this guy was 86 years old when he was burned at the stake for refusing to renounce Christianity. And reading from this history book of Eusebius, there's an account of his trial and his execution. It picks up at the trial where the governor is talking to him. It says, the governor pressed him, saying, "Swear, and I will set you free. Denounce Christ." And Polycarp replies, "For 86 years I've been his servant, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" The governor persisted. He said, "Swear by Caesar's fortune." Sort of put your faith in Caesar, because at the time the Roman emperors were considered gods as well. And Polycarp replied, "If you imagine that I will swear by Caesar's fortune, as you put it, pretending not to know who I am, I will tell you plainly, I am a Christian. If you wish to study the Christian doctrine, choose a day and you shall hear it." The governor replies, "I have wild beasts, and I will throw you to them if you don't change your attitude." And Polycarp replies, "Call them." The governor says, "If you make light of the beasts, I'll have you destroyed by fire unless you change your attitude." And Polycarp answered, "The fire you threaten burns for a time and is soon extinguished. There is a fire you know nothing about, the fire of the judgment to come and of eternal punishment, the fire reserved for the ungodly. But why do you hesitate? Do what you want." And because of his defiance, he was burned at the stake. And this sort of persecution was pretty widespread, and there was a lot of Christians burned at the stake or thrown to wild animals, or I won't go into some of the tortures that were performed, but it was terrible stuff. And that continued right up until the year 312 AD, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And that was a fairly pivotal moment in the history of Christianity. So the story goes that in the year 312, the Roman Empire had split. There was a civil war, and there was sort of two empires. There was the Eastern Roman Empire, that was led by Constantine, and the capital of that was in Byzantium. And then there was the Western Roman Empire, which was led by a different guy named Maxentius, and that had its capital in Rome. Constantine eventually won that battle and captured Rome, but he kept his capital in Byzantium and then renamed it after himself to call it Constantinople. So as he was getting towards the end of this war, just as he was about to capture Rome, Constantine apparently saw a vision in the sky, and this historian Eusebius recounts what happened in a different book. He says, about the time of the midday sun, so at noon, when the day was just turning, he said he saw with his own eyes up in the sky and resting over the sun a cross-shaped trophy formed from light and a text attached to it which said, "By this you will conquer." So he understood that meant, by the Christian faith, by following Christ, you will, win all your battles against your enemies. And this is a bit of a picture of what it looks like on the right there. It says, the trophy is later described as a tall pole plated with gold with a transverse bar, so, cross shape, forming the shape of a cross. And at the extreme top was a wreath woven of precious stones, and gold letters had been fastened on it. There were two letters imitating the first two characters of the name Christ, forming the monogram of the sage's title, Rho being intersected in the middle by Chi. Rho and Chi, if you see up on the top left of this slide here, this is the Greek word for Christ. It says Christos. So the first letter is chi. It's got like a k sound. The P-shaped thing is actually a rho, so it's an R sound. So k r it's os. And on this emblem that Constantine used everywhere, and you can see in these other pictures, all the early Romans, all the early Christian crusaders, all had this chi rho symbol on it. So you've got the chi, the X shape, and then you've got the rho, the P shape, right on top of each other. And this symbol was the early symbol for Christianity, well before everyone started wearing crosses and everything. It was used absolutely everywhere. If you see like some ancient church architecture, you'll definitely see that chi rho symbol all over the place. And depictions of Roman soldiers after 312 all had this chi rho thing on their shields. But as much as I'd like to keep talking about the Roman Empire, I will get back to the scriptures. So Daniel 11 continues on in verse 34. It says, "Now when they shall fall," so this is talking about the Christians at this point. "When they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. They shall be helped with a little help. But many shall cleave for them with flatteries." So what this is talking about is when Constantine became a Christian and made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, it put a complete stop to persecution and execution of Christians all over the place. And this was the little help that they were holpen with. But it goes on to say, "But many shall cleave to them with flatteries." Because what happened when the whole empire overnight converted from worshipping Jupiter, Saturn, Apollo, all of them, you can bet that most of the people who converted over were not very sincere about it. You get a letter from the government saying, "Hey, you're a Christian now." You can imagine just how enthusiastic they would be. But regardless, they joined themselves to the church because they were told to, and because they'd probably be killed if they weren't. But when you're in that situation, a lot of them didn't follow Christ with truth and sincerity. And that's what it means by "they shall cleave to them with flatteries." They join themselves to the church, but with lip service, with sort of empty service to Christ. And going on in verse 35, "And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed." So this verse 35 goes on right to the end of time. So up to where we are now in today and beyond that. So even though Christianity was the state religion of Rome, that was established by something called the Edict of Milan in 312 AD. That didn't stop the persecution. It just changed people's reasons for doing it. See, the state version of Christianity was what we'd recognize today as Catholicism. And if we assume that our doctrine is, the original godly or OG Christianity, there are certainly some differences between what we believe and what the Catholics believe. As would be the case, there were difference between what the state religion of Christianity was and what the church believed, who was sort of sitting within inside that. So in 325 AD, 13 years after this conversion of the empire, Constantine held this meeting, and they called this the proper method of worship. And the Greek word for that is orthodox, or right worship. And anyone who didn't follow the orthodox religion was subject to torture and execution, just as cruel as when it was against Christians by pagans. And this sort of persecution by the Catholics against people who didn't follow their exact orthodoxy continues up to the present day. After all, it says, "even to the time of the end," in verse 35. There's plenty of examples in history of Catholics persecuting other branches of Christianity. There's the Spanish Inquisition, there's the Munster Rebellion, there's all the events leading up to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. There's the not so much the case, but when Henry VIII split off the Church of England from the Catholic Church, they went and attacked them as well. So, like it says in verse 34, it was help, but it was only a little help. They got about 13 years of reprieve before the bishops standardized things and started killing people for doing anything differently. Now, this series of events is also described in the book of Revelation, quite interestingly, starting in chapter 12 of Revelation. It says in chapter 12, verse 1, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. This is a symbol of the early church. And in Revelation 12, verse 3, it says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And this is a symbol of the Roman Empire, with the various kings and the various other things relating to the 7 heads and 10 horns, which I don't have time to get into tonight. So the woman symbolized the church, and we see her described elsewhere as the bride of Christ. And in Revelation 12, verse 13, it says, and when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman, which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness into her place. So the dragon, which was the Roman Empire, persecuted the early church, which was the woman, and she fled away. And we pick it up again a few chapters later, in chapter 17 of Revelation, where we see the woman in the wilderness again. But this time it's a bit different. In Revelation 17, verse 3, it says, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-covered beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So the red dragon from chapter 12 is now a scarlet beast. Still red scarlet dragon beast. It's the same creature. But this time, the beast that had been persecuting her before, she now sits on top of it, and she's joined to it. Because this symbolizes what happened in Rome. The early church, who was the woman, the bride of Christ, has now become joined to the Roman Empire as the state religion, and has become, as it describes, the whore of Babylon. In Revelation 17, verse 4, it says, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. It's an interesting lesson to be learned there. For 300 years, the devil tried to destroy the church through persecution and through intimidation. But in the end, that only made it grow and made it spread. It made Christianity stronger. For all the people who died, if you read these accounts of the early martyrs, a lot of them, there were plenty of people who were afraid of dying and who, denied Christ when they were pushed. But there were plenty more who willingly went to martyrdom, knowing that there was a greater prize waiting for them. It's incredibly inspiring to read those early accounts, and really makes you feel like you haven't done anything, and any suffering that we've been through is just absolutely nothing compared to what these guys went through. But that first 300 years or so, when the devil and the Roman Empire were persecuting the church, and it all just kind of backfired and made it even stronger. But then what happened is the persecution went away, and their lives got easy. And when that happened, the church became complacent and corrupted and compromised, and they corrupted what was pure doctrine before, and they became this abomination in the end. And in doing so, they became part of the beast. So the very church was now, as it says, drunken with the blood of the martyrs. The church that was meant to be upholding them and strengthening them was now completely complicit in all this persecution. So I think it's a good lesson there, that we can look back on this and see what happened to that early church because of complacency. And as hard as it is, appreciate any suffering that we do go through, appreciate any persecution that comes our way, and not to get complacent. And I'll leave it there.